In the summer of 1942, a young American pilot climbed into the cockpit of a fighter, so scorned by aviation critics that some generals had already written it off as a lost cause. The sky above North Africa blazed with heat. The runway beneath his wheels was cracked desert hardpan, dusted with sand that found its way into every instrument, every bearing, every breath. He was flying a Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, a machine that the aviation press had called slow, underpowered, and outmatched by almost every opponent it was likely to face. He knew all of that. He flew anyway. That pilot came home. He came home because the men who wrote off the P-40 had never watched it absorb a burst of cannon fire that would have torn apart something more elegant and keep flying. They had never watched it dive through a formation of enemy transports and scatter them like leaves. They had never seen what it could do in the hands of a pilot who understood its temper. The P-40 was not the fastest thing in the sky. It was not the most agile, but it was honest, it was rugged, and in the hands of the right engineer and the right pilot, it was exactly the weapon the Allies needed in their darkest hour. That story begins not with the aircraft itself, but with the engineer who shaped its bones. Donovan Rees Berlin, a man who spent years being told that his best ideas were not good enough, only to watch them win a war. Donovan Berlin was born in 1900 in Michigan, a product of the same industrial heartland that produced so many of America's mechanical minds. He studied at the University of Michigan, where he absorbed the principles of aerodynamics with the same quiet intensity that would define his career. He was not a showman. He did not work in spotless laboratories or deliver speeches to rooms full of generals. He worked at a drafting table, in a factory surrounded by noise and disagreement, refining ideas that others dismissed until they could no longer be ignored. He joined the Curtiss Aeroplane and Motor Company in the 1930s, at a moment when the American aviation industry was scrambling to catch up with a world that was arming itself at terrifying speed. Germany was producing fighters with aggressive geometry and raw power. Japan was building aircraft of startling agility. Britain was racing to perfect the Spitfire. And the United States was trying to figure out what kind of war it was heading toward, and what kind of aircraft would win it. Berlin's answer began with the Curtiss Hawk 75, a monoplane fighter developed in the mid-1930s that introduced streamlined design principles and retractable landing gear at a time when biplanes were still the standard. The Hawk 75 was a serious aircraft for its era. It found buyers abroad, particularly in France, where it acquitted itself respectably against the Luftwaffe in the early months of the war. But Berlin was already thinking beyond it. He saw the limitations before they appeared in combat reports. He understood that the Hawk 75's airframe, while clean, was fundamentally a foundation for something larger, faster, and more capable. The question was what engine would power it, and whether that engine would be given the right architecture to breathe. Those questions would define the next decade of his career. The answer the Army Air Corps initially handed him was the Allison V-1710. On paper, it was a promising power plant, a 12-cylinder liquid-cooled engine that produced around 1,000 horsepower and gave the aircraft a long, elegant nose profile which was sufficient to win a production contract. The Army ordered over 200 aircraft in the largest single fighter procurement the Air Corps had made to that point. It looked, briefly, like Donovan Berlin had built something the country needed. Then the war revealed the truth about the Allison engine, and everything changed. The Allison V-1710 was a superb engine at low and medium altitudes. Below 15,000 feet, it produced reliable power and gave the P-40 genuine speed and a solid rate of climb. But it had a fatal architectural flaw for a frontline fighter. Its single-stage supercharger could not maintain adequate air density for combustion as the aircraft climbed above 15,000 feet. The higher the aircraft went, the more the engine choked. By 20,000 feet, a Spitfire or a Messerschmitt 109 could pull away from a P-40 with contemptuous ease. In the high-altitude arena that defined the air battles over Britain and Germany, the Allison-powered P-40 was simply outclassed. The critics seized on this. Aviation commentators, several generals, and no small number of test pilots began to articulate what would become the conventional wisdom about the P-40. It was, they said, a transitional aircraft at best. An interim solution to be replaced as quickly as possible by something better. The Lockheed P-38 and the Republic P-47 were coming. The North American P-51 Mustang was in development. The P-40, they argued, was already obsolescent before it had fired a shot in anger. Donovan Berlin did not accept this verdict. He understood something the critics had missed entirely. The war was not going to be fought exclusively at high altitudes. It was going to be fought in deserts and jungles, over beaches and rail lines, at altitudes where the Allison engine was perfectly capable. And in those environments, the characteristics of the P-40 that the critics scorned, its weight, its toughness, its resistance to structural failure, were not weaknesses, they were assets. He went back to the drafting table. The result was the P-40D and the P-40E, aircraft that represented a fundamental rethinking of what the Warhawk was supposed to be. Berlin recognized that trying to make the P-40 compete with purpose-built high-altitude interceptors was the wrong ambition. What the aircraft could be, what it was genuinely suited for, was a fighter bomber, a close air support platform that could absorb punishment, carry heavy payloads, and operate from the kind of crude forward airstrips that more refined aircraft couldn't tolerate. He revised the nose. The earlier models had featured a chin radiator that created unnecessary drag and provided poor cooling efficiency under sustained combat conditions. Berlin reworked this into a more efficient arrangement, bringing the radiator intake beneath the engine and cleaning up the fuselage lines. The result shaved drag and improved cooling simultaneously. He also redesigned the armament installation, moving to 6 50 caliber machine guns in the wings, a devastating broadside that would prove brutally effective against aircraft and ground targets alike. The landing gear was strengthened. The fuel tanks were protected with a layer of self-sealing material that would save pilots from fire on dozens of occasions when a less durable aircraft would simply have exploded. The cockpit armour was thickened. Berlin was building something that could take a beating and keep flying, because he knew the environments where it would be used would demand exactly that. These changes added weight, and the critics noted this with satisfaction. A heavier P-40 was, in their view, simply a slower and even more mediocre P-40. What they failed to understand was that Berlin was deliberately trading ceiling performance for payload capacity and survivability, an exchange that would prove its value in the desert, in the Pacific, and across the Eastern Front. The high-altitude problem, however, could not simply be engineered away with airframe modifications. If the P-40 was going to be useful in theatres where it might encounter enemy fighters at altitude, it needed a better engine. Berlin knew this. The Army Air Corps knew this. And in the early 1940s, one solution presented itself with extraordinary clarity. The Packard VAS 1650, the American-built version of the Rolls-Royce Merlin, was the engine that had transformed the P-51 Mustang from a mediocre low-altitude fighter into a machine that could escort bombers all the way to Berlin. The Merlin was a masterpiece of supercharger engineering. Its two-stage, two-speed supercharger maintained combustion efficiency at altitudes where the Allison simply gasped. If Berlin could put a Merlin into the P-40 airframe, the aircraft's worst efficiency would be eliminated overnight. He did exactly that, and the result was the P-40F. The transformation was measurable and immediate. Where the Allison-powered variants had struggled above 15,000 feet, the Merlin-equipped P-40F maintained genuine combat capability up to 20,000 feet and beyond. The rate of climb improved substantially. Top speed at altitude increased. The aircraft that critics had written off as an altitude-limited stopgap suddenly possessed characteristics that made it competitive with enemy fighters across a much wider altitude band. Pilots who flew the F variant reported a sense of power and responsiveness that the earlier models had never provided, particularly when pulling away from a threat in a climbing turn or pressing an attack through defensive fire. But Berlin had walked into a supply problem that no amount of engineering could solve. The Merlin engine was in ferocious demand. Rolls-Royce in Britain was working at absolute capacity. Packard in America was building Merlins as fast as its production lines allowed, and every one of those engines was committed. The P-51 Mustang, which the Army Air Force had identified as its primary long-range escort fighter, consumed Merlin production with an appetite that left almost nothing for other programs. The P-40F was built in numbers, but those numbers were constrained by the simple reality that the engines for something considered more important kept taking priority. Berlin watched as his high-altitude solution was quietly throttled by the arithmetic of wartime production. The Allison engine returned as the primary power plant. But he had not given up on improving the aircraft, and his next problem was one that had been quietly threatening pilot safety since the P-40 first entered high-speed dives. At speeds above 400 miles per hour in a steep descent, the P-40 exhibited a tendency toward directional instability. The aircraft would yaw unpredictably, making it difficult to hold a steady sight picture and, in extreme cases, threatening to depart controlled flight entirely. This was not a minor annoyance. In combat, where a pilot might need to hold a diving attack run through heavy defensive fire, an aircraft that wandered off heading could mean the difference between a precision strike and a wasted pass, or a collision with the target. Berlin's solution was elegant in its simplicity. He stretched the fuselage by approximately 20 inches behind the cockpit, increasing the moment arm of the vertical tail surface and giving the aircraft's directional stability a significant improvement. The result was the P-40N, the definitive production variant, which handled with noticeably more authority and high-speed maneuvering and gave pilots the confidence to push the aircraft to its limits without worrying that it would bite them. The P-40N was also the lightest of the major production variants, the product of a systematic weight reduction effort that stripped unnecessary equipment and simplified systems wherever possible. Berlin had managed, across the long development arc of the P-40 family, to produce an aircraft that was simultaneously tougher, better armed, more stable, and lighter than the machine he had started with. It was a remarkable engineering achievement, even if the world was too distracted by more glamorous aircraft to notice. What the world noticed instead was what the P-40 did when it entered combat. The Soviet Union received hundreds of P-40s under the Lend-Lease program beginning in 1941, and the early experience was genuinely troubled. The Allison engine was sensitive to extreme cold in ways that Soviet ground crews, accustomed to their own hardy power plants, found difficult to manage. Engines seized, carburetors iced, hydraulic systems thickened and refused to function. Aircraft that were serviceable on paper sat frozen on airstrips while the Luftwaffe operated overhead. Soviet pilots, trained on the more forgiving characteristics of their own aircraft, found the P-40's cockpit procedures demanding and its engine management unforgiving. The criticism that came back from the Eastern Front was withering. Soviet reports characterized the P-40 as mechanically unreliable, poorly suited to winter conditions, and inferior in performance to the German fighters it was supposed to counter. These reports were not wrong, but they were incomplete. They described what happened when an advanced aircraft from one industrial tradition was handed to operators from another without adequate technical support or winterization procedures. The problems were solvable, and they were solved. Soviet mechanics and American technical advisors working together developed winterization kits that preheated the engine before start, modified the carburetor heating system, or an added insulation to the hydraulic lines. Lubricants were changed to grades that remained fluid at temperatures that would freeze standard oil solid. Soviet pilots were given more thorough type conversion training, with emphasis on the engine management procedures that made the Allison reliable rather than fragile. Once properly winterized and properly flown, the P-40 on the Eastern Front became a different aircraft. Soviet units deployed it effectively in the ground attack role, where the aircraft's ruggedness and its .650 caliber machine guns made it a lethal presence against German vehicle columns, supply lines and airfield installations. It was not the best fighter the Soviet Air Force operated, but it was useful in ways that the early reports had obscured, and it flew in numbers that made a material difference to the burden Soviet pilots carried in those desperate years. One detail that rarely makes the history books deserves to be said plainly. The Soviet pilots who flew the P-40 in the most intense months of fighting along the Cuban bridgehead in the spring of 1943 were using the aircraft in a combined arms role that anticipates how modern close air support is conducted today. They operated in tight coordination with ground forces, orbiting over the front lines at low altitude, responding to radio calls from infantry commanders, and striking German armour and artillery positions with strafing runs that often began below 100 feet. The P-40 could absorb the ground fire that came with those passes. Other aircraft often could not. The ground crews working those airfields understood this, and they kept the aircraft serviceable through conditions that should have grounded a more delicate machine 3 times over. That relationship between a tough aircraft and determined maintainers is what operational endurance actually looks like, and the P-40 delivered it month after month on the bloodiest front of the war. The aircraft's true theatre, though, was North Africa. This was the environment Donovan Berlin had been designing for, even if he had not known it consciously. The Western Desert was a place of extremes: searing heat, blowing sand, improvised airstrips hacked out of rock and gravel, and supply lines so extended that every aircraft had to be maintained with whatever was on hand. The Spitfire, for all its extraordinary performance, was a thoroughbred that demanded careful handling and clean conditions. The P-40 was a workhorse that could be kept flying with ingenuity, determination, and the tools in a field kit. Desert Air Force squadrons, British, South African, Australian, American, flew the P-40 across North Africa from the desperate days before El Alamein through the final destruction of Axis forces in Tunisia. They used it as a fighter, an escort, a dive bomber, and a ground attack platform, switching roles depending on what the situation required. The aircraft carried bombs, rockets, and drop tanks. It escorted convoys and strafed supply columns. It flew in conditions that would have grounded less durable machines and kept flying when conditions deteriorated beyond what the maintenance manual said was acceptable. The episode that became the most dramatic testament to the P-40's capability in that theatre unfolded on the 18th of April 1943 over the Gulf of Tunis. German forces in North Africa were finished. The Axis bridgehead was collapsing and the Wehrmacht was attempting to evacuate key personnel and supplies using large formations of transport aircraft, Junkers 52s and Messerschmitt 323s, flying under fighter escort across the Mediterranean. American intelligence detected the evacuation flights, and a force of P-40s from the 57th Fighter Group was vectored to intercept. What followed lasted less than 15 minutes and became known in American aviation history as the Palm Sunday Massacre. The P-40s found a formation of roughly 100 Axis transport aircraft flying in tight defensive groups, escorted by Messerschmitt 109s and Machi C-202s. In the engagement that followed, the American pilots used the P-40's strengths with devastating effect. They attacked at medium altitude, diving through the transport formations with their 50 caliber guns blazing, then using the aircraft's superior diving speed to disengage before the escort fighters could bring them to a turning fight. In the space of a single afternoon, they destroyed over 50 Axis aircraft, many of them the irreplaceable transport machines carrying men and material the Wehrmacht could not afford to lose. The Palm Sunday Massacre was not won because the P-40 was faster or more maneuverable than its opponents. It was won because the pilots had learned to fight the aircraft the way Donovan Berlin had built it, as a hitting weapon, not a dancing weapon. The P-40 was built to strike hard and disengage quickly, using its diving ability and its firepower to do the work that a Zero or a Spitfire might have done with superior agility. In the hands of pilots who understood this, it was not a mediocre aircraft. It was a precision instrument applied to exactly the right task. Across the Pacific, the same lesson had to be learned in blood before it became doctrine. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941, the P-40 was the primary fighter defending American interests across much of the Pacific and Southeast Asia. The results in the immediate aftermath were catastrophic, and all pilots who had been trained to dogfight, to turn and maneuver in the tradition of the Great War, found themselves at a brutal disadvantage against the Mitsubishi A6M0. The Zero was lighter, more agile, and could outturn virtually anything that tried to engage it in a conventional circling fight. P-40s that attempted to turn with the Zero were quickly outmaneuvered and shot down. The learning curve was steep, and the tuition was measured in lives. But within weeks, those who survived had figured out what the aircraft could and could not do. The P-40 could not turn with the Zero. It could dive faster than the Zero. Its construction was heavier and more resilient, meaning it could absorb hits that would destroy the lightly built Japanese fighter. Its firepower was heavier, meaning that when a burst connected, the damage was severe. The answer was altitude, speed, and aggression. P-40 pilots learned to maintain altitude advantage before any engagement, to dive through Japanese formations with their speed built up, to fire short bursts and immediately extend away before the Zero's superior turning rate could be brought to bear. The tactic required iron discipline, the suppression of every instinct that said to stay and fight, but it worked. Against pilots who followed the doctrine, the P-40 held its own. At Milne Bay in August and September of 1942, Royal Australian Air Force P-40s flying from a muddy jungle airstrip played a decisive role in repelling the first Japanese land invasion to be defeated on the ground in the Pacific War. The conditions at Milne Bay were almost unimaginable. The airstrip was a strip of pierced steel planking laid over a swamp at the eastern tip of New Guinea. Rain fell in almost continuous sheets. The aircraft sat in standing water between sorties. Ground crews worked in conditions that should have made maintenance impossible. The P-40s flew anyway. They provided close air support for the Australian infantry holding the perimeter, strafing Japanese landing parties and supply lines with enough effect to deny the attackers the reinforcements they needed to break through. When Japanese aircraft appeared, the P-40 pilots used the altitude advantage their ground controllers gave them to execute exactly the kind of diving attack that had proven so effective in North Africa. The aircraft's ruggedness meant that damage that grounded other types was patched in the field, and the machine returned to service within hours. The Japanese force at Milne Bay was eventually evacuated, defeated. The P-40's contribution was not glamorous. It was not the stuff of ace pilot mythology. It was the grinding, essential work of keeping the enemy's head down and his supply lines cut, performed by an aircraft that was, in the critics' language, mediocre, and in the reality of the battle, indispensable. By the end of 1943, the P-40 was being phased out in favour of the P-51 Mustang and the P-47 Thunderbolt in the theatres, where high-altitude performance was paramount. But Berlin's aircraft continued to serve in roles where its particular combination of qualities made it the right tool. It served with Chinese-American forces in the China-Burma-India theatre, where its ability to operate from primitive airstrips and carry meaningful payloads made it the backbone of operations that more capable but more demanding aircraft could not have sustained. It served in the Mediterranean until the end of the Italian campaign, hauling bombs over mountain roads and strafing rail yards with the methodical efficiency of a machine designed for exactly that kind of work. The final production count for the P-40 family across all variants reached approximately 13,738 aircraft, built between 1939 and 1944. That figure placed it among the most numerically significant American fighters of the entire war. In the years when the P-51 and the P-47 were still being developed and produced in insufficient numbers, the P-40 was there, doing the work, absorbing the attrition, keeping the enemy at bay with the unpretentious competence of an aircraft that had been built to endure. Donovan Berlin received no ticker tape parade. He did not become a household name. The P-40 did not inspire the kind of romantic mythology that surrounded the Spitfire or the Mustang. It was too utilitarian for legend, too practical for poetry. But the engineers who understood what he had done looked at those 13,738 airframes and saw something the critics had never found the language to describe. They saw a decision made correctly. The decision to accept the aircraft's limitations at altitude and design around them, rather than pretend they did not exist. The decision to build an aircraft so tough that combat damage became a recoverable event rather than a death sentence. The decision to prioritize the battlefield realities of the war, the desert strips, the jungle clearings, the frozen Soviet airfields, over the clean metrics of altitude and maximum speed that filled the test reports. The history of the Second World War is filled with aircraft that were faster and higher flying than the P-40, aircraft that achieved more in single engagements and earned more lasting fame. But the war was not won by any single spectacular engagement. It was won by the accumulation of thousands of missions. You have flown from forward bases that gentler aircraft could not have tolerated, by pilots who had learned to trust a machine that never promised them glory, and never failed to bring them home when they flew it with the respect it deserved. Donovan Berlin built that machine. He built it in the face of institutional skepticism, supply constraints, and the relentless competition of programs that consumed resources and attention his aircraft could not match. He refined it through a dozen variants over 6 years without losing the essential character he had given it from the beginning: toughness, adaptability, and the quiet blue-collar reliability of a tool designed not to impress, but to work. The Curtiss P-40 Warhawk never won a beauty contest. It never broke a speed record. When the historians wrote their accounts of the air war, they reached past it toward the faster, sleeker, more photogenic machines that defined the late war sky. The P-40 remained in the shadow of its own successors, dismissed as the aircraft that held the line until something better arrived. That was true. It held the line. For 3 years, from the morning of Pearl Harbor to the eve of the Normandy invasion, it held the line in Africa and Asia and the Pacific, while the aircraft that would win the war at altitude were being built, and the line never broke. There is a particular kind of engineering courage required to build a second-best aircraft and build it brilliantly. It is easier to chase the superlative, to promise the fastest or the highest or the most agile, because superlatives attract funding and fame and the attention of generals. Donovan Berlin chose a harder path. He chose to understand what the war actually needed in the years when the war could still be lost, and he built for that need with every tool he had. He accepted the constraints he could not remove and worked with relentless precision on the ones he could. The result was 13,000 aircraft that kept the Allies in the fight long enough for their better weapons to arrive. The P-40 never got the monument it deserved, but the men who flew it, from the dust of the Western Desert to the mud of New Guinea, knew what it had given them. They knew that a so-called mediocre aircraft, built by an engineer who refused to accept that label, had given them something no performance table could measure: another day to fly and another chance to finish the job.